This year we decided to ask the leaders of the House DFL and leaders of the Republican caucus to send somebody that would talk to us for 15 minutes about why they should be the party in the majority next session. We think it's a fair question. Who's going to be better for Greater Minnesota? As I mentioned, we have two experienced legislators here. Representative Marquart, my left, I know many of you know him because he's been here to the coalition meetings many times to speak. He's 8th term legislator from Moorhead and Detroit Lakes areas. He was mayor of Dilworth for 10 years. That's right 11 years, okay. Who's counting here? Committees that he serves on are Agriculture Committee, Education, Finance, and the very important Property Tax Division of the House Tax Committee. Representative Urdahl is from Grove City, which I think represents, he represents Litchfield and maybe part of Hutchinson? Is that?
I have the good part of Hutchinson.
Okay, he has the good part of Hutchinson. Whatever that means. 7th term legislator. He's a retired teacher. I forgot to mention that Paul is still teaching in the Dilworth Glendon School District, and Representative Urdahl retired as a teacher from the New London Spicer School District. He's also written 4 books. I think he's kind of a history hobbyist. 7? Okay. 8? Okay. What, didn't some of them get published or what? Okay. But he's chair of the Legacy Funding Finance Committee and a member of the Bonding and Ways and Means Committee. So we got 2 really excellent, and I do see Representative Gene Pawlowski is in attendance here, so want to welcome him. And is Clark Johnson here too? Somebody tell me, a couple snuck in? Great, well thank you both for coming. Of course we always welcome legislators to our events. So the project today is to have each of them not talk about, because you know we have many rural legislators from both parties that support all the various programs that we work on, and I think that's true of these legislators, but that's not really the question. The question is, how is Greater Minnesota going to fare if one or the other is in the majority? So to decide who goes first, do we have anybody here ready to do this? Okay. Elizabeth Waithel is going to flip a coin to decide who gets to choose whether they go first or second. So Representative Urdahl is in the majority, so we're going to let him call the coin flip. So Representative Urdahl, when you're ready. A legitimate quarter, no tricks here. All right, you want to flip it there, Elizabeth?
Yeah, call him there.
It's
tails.
It's tails, okay. So would you like to go first, Representative Urdahl, or second?
I'll go second, but
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
yeah, we can't do that. That would be an ethics violation. Okay, so I guess Paul goes first, and I'll turn it over to you. You could stand up at the podium. It might be easier for people to...
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for the invite to be here. I have always appreciated the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities. I've said it is the one group down in St. Paul that understands rural Minnesota and holds legislators accountable. And I've been on both sides of it with Tim, so he is an equal opportunity antagonist, so there's no problem with that. Also great to be here in Austin. Gene Poppy, your representative, every once in a while down in St. Paul we have gatherings at Representative Pawlowski's place. And Gene Poppy always brings the Spam. And it's the first time I ever tasted anything but the regular Spam. I think it was a peppered Spam one night. But and I will tell you that I love Spam. And the best thing you can make with Spam is a hot Spam and cheese sandwich. So you first of all fry the Spam. And then you do it the rest of the way just like a grilled cheese sandwich. You butter both sides, put the cheese on, and it is. And then I put mayonnaise or Miracle Whip on top. It is excellent if you ever try that. So anyway, we're not here so much, maybe I should get going on this. But I want to tell you that it's nice also to be here with Representative Urdahl, who I've worked on a lot of things with. And I am not a real partisan guy. In fact, if you go back, and Clark Johnson is here, I want to make sure he is also a esteemed colleague and a great fighter for rural Minnesota and coalition. The Pioneer Press came out,
And of course, Gene Pulaski.
and of course, I mentioned Gene Pulaski here at his gatherings, but you have, the Pioneer Press came out June 24th, and they had an article where they analyzed the 500 votes in the legislature in this last session. And what they found out is that the House is starkly partisan, which is no surprise to anyone. And they had a diagram, a chart, where they had all the Republicans voting together. And then they had there all the Democrats voting together. And there were 3 legislators in the middle that they said actually worked with both political parties. And it was Representative Pulaski, Representative Poppe, and myself. So I say that because I'm going to make a case here for the DFL. But I am not a highly partisan person, either is Representative Urdahl. But I do think there are some huge fundamental differences on the huge issues that make, I think, a very clear case for a DFL majority in rural Minnesota. And I think it's a simple vision for rural Minnesota, and that is to make sure rural Minnesota has the tools to create a world-class economy and also have an excellent quality of life at the same time. And you do that by starting out with making sure that everyone has a high quality of life and they have top-notch services at an affordable cost. And the bedrock to that is local government aid. Without local government aid, nothing else can you build off of that. You can't build your economy off that. You can't build the other things that are going to make rural Minnesota great. And so you start with local government aid, and then on the economic side, it's broadband, it's education, it's transportation, workforce housing, and workforce development. Now, it's a simple plan, but if you're going to get it done, you can't be squishy around the edges. You have to go all out, because we're competing with a lot of other things in the state. So if you're a rural legislator and you truly want to move rural Minnesota forward with what the vision I just laid out here, you've got to be all in. So let's start with local government aid. That is the heart and soul of rural Minnesota. That is the bedrock. It is part of rural Minnesota's DNA. It's the canary in the mine shaft as far as what rural Minnesota is doing. And it is the one program we have in this state that makes sure that you've got safe streets, you can get out after 6 inches of snow on those streets, you've got parks and libraries, and you get all those at an affordable cost. Local government aid, $341 million goes just to rural Minnesota. $341 million to rural Minnesota, 65% of the program. It's huge. How big of an impact would it be? Austin, for example. The city of Austin here gets $8 million in local government aid. The levy for Austin is $4.9 million. If you were to eliminate local government aid, Austin would have to increase its levy 2.5 times, up to over $12 million. Even if you went 50% cuts, you'd have to cut $4 million from services and still almost double your property taxes. Albert Lee, $5.2 million in local government aid. Their levy is $6.2 million. If you were to eliminate local government aid, Albert Lee would have to raise their taxes 85%. I want to know how many communities in here think they could attract people and businesses and keep their city viable if they didn't have local government aid. It is that huge. So, What are the political parties' positions on this? Back in 13 and 14, when we had a $627 million deficit, the House majority increased local government aid $80 million. And then the next year, another 9 to 10 million. In a deficit, increased at $80 million. Property taxes around the state went down for the first time since Kelly Clarkson first won the American Idol back in 2002. First time. Over those 2 years, property taxes on homeowners went down $41 million and on businesses $55 million. It was huge. It really helped. Let's flip now to 2015. A $2 billion surplus, and the House GOP cuts local government aid $84 million in a huge surplus. We didn't have a tax bill. This year, payable 2016, property taxes are going up over $400 billion. And if you look at the numbers, on the average city in rural Minnesota, property taxes are seeing an increase seven times higher than Minneapolis. That's how important local government aid is. Let me give you something else, because I know I've spent a lot of time on local government aid, but like I said, without local government aid, all these other things, you're not going to get there without local government aid. Your political parties, your leadership, they basically set their intentions and their goals and their direction through their chairpersons. When the DFL had control in the House from 07 to 10, their property tax chair, which works the closest with LGA, the DFL picked a former mayor from Dilworth who knew a lot about LGA. For 4 years, I chaired that division. When the Republicans took control in 2011, who did they name as the property tax chair who's going to work the closest with LGA? Linda Runbeck. And in March of 2011, they were cutting LGA, and I asked her in committee, why are you cutting LGA? And she said, quote, it's the beginning of the phase out of local government aid. All right, let's go to the next 2 years, 13 and 14. Democrats select Jim Dabney, a strong supporter of local government aid, as their chair. And we increased local government aid $80 million. This last time, Republicans back in charge, their chair, property tax division, the person who's going to watch over local government aid, Representative Driscowski. I think we could say he is not a great fan of local government aid. So I will guarantee you this. This is a guarantee. Is that if the DFL has a House majority, not only will there be a chairperson on property taxes who strongly supports LGA, but there will be an increase in local government aid. No second thoughts. That's a done deal. And I know you guys would like to get to about $564 million, that 45.5 increase. I'd like us to go back to the 2003 levels before it got cut, and that was $587 million. That's what I would push for. So I know I spent a lot of time on local government aid, but I think that is the DNA of rural Minnesota. I think as a rural legislator that the Secretary of State should put on the application when you file for office, do you support LGA? And if you put no, I'm sorry, you can't run. I mean, that's, and I know Representative Urdahl supports LGA. He does. But the leadership sets the tone, and they set those chairs. And it makes it very, very difficult when you have someone as a chair who's blocking things. It makes it difficult. So let's move to the economic side. I don't know how much time I have.
30 seconds.
What?
Is that right, Julie? The 19?
Are you kidding me? Okay, so let's talk about, we got broadband, which is crucial. And we know we're way behind, we're being treated as second-class citizens, and the governor had $100 million, the Senate had 85, and the House had 15. We've got to do a lot better than that. And I could go on, we're not even in transportation, maybe there'll be a question, but I want to add one more thing about the ability to compromise. I've been in the legislature 16 years. So 8 times I've gone through a budget cycle. 8 times. 3 times when the House was controlled by the DFL, and 5 times it was controlled by the House Republicans. All 3 times controlled by the House DFL, and it was with Governor Plenty and Governor Deep, Republican, Democrat alike. We got done on time, no special session. In all 5 times with a House majority, whether or not it was an independent governor, Republican governor, a Democratic governor, or a Republican or Democratic Senate, the common denominator was a Republican House, all 5 times special session with 2 government shutdowns, including the longest one in our nation's history in 2011. You've got to be able to compromise. You can't be ideological. You can't be ideologues. And a person like Dean Urdahl is not an ideologue. But you have those in these political parties that cannot compromise. And so there'll be time, and I'm done. But I think local government aid is really huge. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to questions.
Well, thank you. See, the reason I write remarks down like this is so that I don't go over. So I'm going to try not to anyway. I'd like to thank everyone for the invitation to be here today. And do appreciate this. I've been to a few of these meetings over the years. It's my task to try to explain to you why the Republican Party deserves your consideration and support. And as Paul has pointed out, I'm not a real ideologue. I'm not a real partisan, and I think that'll come out as I talk here. This year, although today I will be a little more partisan than I normally am, this year was the 2nd year of the biennium. It's important to note that most of our spending and budget bills were passed the 1st year. The exceptions were taxes and transportation. Bonding is normally done in an even year. I'd like to cite accomplishments from the last year and how they did impact Greater Minnesota. First, long-term care. Nursing homes are among the biggest employers in many of our small towns. Last session, the legislature, under a bill authored by Joe Schumacher, agreed to address rates for providers and improve access to quality care to our most vulnerable Minnesotans. And we fixed an unfair nursing home reimbursement rate that had been heavily slanted toward the metro area. $150 million in new revenue was allocated to nursing homes. I tried over the years to fix this uneven rate with both Republican and DFL control. Was unable to do so. Sometimes at times it's just not right, but fortunately in the brief time Republicans had the Senate, I was able to help a nursing home in my district with their rates. In education, we are funding K-12 education at historic levels, more than $600 million in new revenue during this past biennium. And let me emphasize that rural Republicans have their own caucus. We get together once a week. And as someone with roots in Greater Minnesota and in education, I did advise House Republican leadership about mid-session last year that we're going to have to fund education at a level of at least 2% for each of the 2 years. I believe at that time the governor and the House and Senate DFL were about at 1% increases. We in the House Republicans were 0.5. I tried to explain why that wasn't a good idea, and they said that's why we don't have you negotiating. Now, realizing that these numbers were all part of negotiating, I lobbied hard for 2%, representing the views of rural House Republicans. And I believe that our views were part of the reason why the final was 2 and 2. We also provided funding for facilities maintenance, which will help reduce spending disparities for Greater Minnesota school districts and help preserve our school buildings. We reformed teacher licensure to address teacher shortages in rural Minnesota. Unfortunately, the State Board of Teaching, many DFL appointees have blocked the will of the legislature and are going to have to go to court over that. But we do need more teachers in rural Minnesota, in high demand areas. We place greater emphasis on vocational programs and rural workforce needs. We provided tuition relief to MNSCU students and scholarships for high demand. 2-year college tuition was frozen. I know that Representative Pulowski was very instrumental in helping out in our higher education system over the years, and certainly more needs to be done. Rural economic development. We prioritize private sector job and business growth, filling vacant positions for skilled workers and more. We funded $4 million for workforce housing in Greater Minnesota and $10.5 million in broadband grants. 2 skilled job training programs will help place and train workers immediately in positions where regional need is highest. We increased funding in tourism and rural career counseling, and we did pass $35 million in broadband, which will be coupled with $100 million in federal money, and we'll see how far that goes. In my district, it did one town of 50 people, but that's just the $35 million. The $100 million I hope will be more helpful. In agriculture, we included liability protection for agritourism events, expanded agricultural loan payments, programs and modifications allowing counties to work together in collecting waste pesticides. We extended the Agricultural Growth Research and Innovation Program to 2025. $19 million was allocated to combat avian flu. And we did this with 2 farmers as Agriculture Committee chairs. And I believe that Gene Poppy, of course, was an ag chair, representing a rural district, but then there was also a Minneapolis lawyer chairing one of the other committees in agriculture. That's when we weren't in the majority. More funding was approved for railroad safety in the grade safety account and Greater Minnesota Transit. In legacy funding, the committee that I chair, nearly 90% of the funding went to Greater Minnesota. When I chaired the committee in 2011-12, rural House Republicans insisted on a funding level for Greater Minnesota Parks and Trails. Before this, they had none and were dependent upon the DNR, and you all know that's not something you want to be dependent upon. When the DFL was in power, I offered a bill to protect rural energy consumers from suffering rate hikes to cover costs when natural disasters strike. And Representative Pulowski also was very involved in this. We had difficulty getting it through at that time. Fortunately, in this last session, and I do credit again Representative Pulowski for his work on this, we managed to get this passed with both of our sponsorships and the Republican majority. In transportation, we did some things other than what was in the bill that failed to pass. We approved funding for small cities with fewer than 5,000 residents for needed street repair. Now, as you've likely noticed, many of these needed reforms and programs could have been done by the DFL when they were in control, but they didn't. I think there was a rush to judgment by some after the first year of the biennium. We heard that House Republicans hadn't lived up to our commitments to rural Minnesota. Of course, again, our term is 2 years, and in the second year, most of our commitments were addressed in the bills that passed off the House floor. The end of the session was a huge disappointment. To let confusion over the words and or derail the tax bill was terrible. This was a conjunction malfunction that didn't merit a veto. Well, I made that up. Now, we do work together, and I want to credit Gene, as I already have, and also Paul Marquart, of course, for supporting some of my education reform legislation. Paul was helpful to me even when I'm in the minority, and I've been half and half so far. Frankly, when you're a minority legislator, you have to learn to cross the aisle, or you won't be successful. And there are certainly times that it makes sense for rural members, Republican and Democrat, to join together on common interests, and we're able to do that. Unfortunately, it's changed in the 14 years that I've been there. The partisan divide, I think, is becoming greater, and it bothers me when there are times when I know that there's a good DFL piece of legislation that I should be able to vote for, and they, I'm sure, experience it from the other side. And no, we can't. It'll help them too much. Or you see something in a DFL bill that you know, you got an idea that you could change that and make it better and make it something that could be supported by everybody. But you hear, no, you can't make their bad bills better. And I know that they hear the same thing. And that's a real unfortunate circumstance. You know, we're there to try to do the best we can for the people that we represent, and that should mean working together for our common interests more than we do. But unfortunately, I feel more and more that walls are being built that prohibit us from doing that. Regarding the stalemate we get to in the end, I think committees getting their targets earlier certainly would help. I think maybe we should have a task force of former speakers and majority leaders and minority leaders and to get together and go over what suggestions they might have to have a better end to the session. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about what didn't happen, but hopefully still will. We passed a bonding and transportation bill with overwhelming bipartisan support. Most of the concerns that Paul has addressed are in these bills. Bills that were either vetoed by the governor or failed because of a last-minute DFL Senate amendment. I pray that these excellent bills with valuable provisions for all Minnesotans, especially Greater Minnesota, will soon be passed in a special session. And what do? Well, in short, we do have increases for LGA of $20 million. Now, in that $88 million increase that the DFL had, they claimed it would result in massive property tax decreases. In some areas there were decreases, but in other areas there were increases. And proportionately, I felt that Minneapolis and St. Paul came out a lot better than rural Minnesota did. And regarding the cuts that Paul mentioned, in that first tax bill that we did last year, we knew that things were going to have to change in conference committee. And they certainly did. The tax bill provides $146 billion in tax relief for every small business in Minnesota. It exempts the first $100,000 of commercial industrial property tax. Farmers have a $90.6 million in tax relief. And I do want to mention quickly in that bonding bill, the PFA, $140 million in PFA, water, wastewater, clean water. I said to our caucus members, the suburban ones, do you think that these things just magically appear, that the water towers just spring up out of the soil? No. PFA and the things in the bonding bill are extremely important, especially to our small towns, and I will continue to make sure that that is addressed. We had a couple $100 million also in local roads and bridges, so there are good things in this bonding bill, good things in this tax bill, and I certainly hope that in special session, which I hope is going to happen in August, we get this done. Thank you.
Go ahead, each one of you.
I think the answer very good. I'm a lot more optimistic than I was a month ago, but the governor and I know the speaker and Senate Majority Leader Bach have gotten together. They haven't put everything together, but I just see the momentum moving, and I would say the chances are much better that we will have. When I agree with what Dina said, we've got excellent things in that tax bill we need to get through and a lot of good bonding bill things, but kind of the hang-up is going to be the transportation portion on the bonding bill, earmarks versus transit and other things.
I agree with Paul. I think that the signs are pointing toward being able to get this done. I mean, I thought we'd do it right away, like a couple days after session. And then there was a time where I thought it looked pretty bad, but it's improving. I've talked to the speaker. I actually spoke with the governor. And by the way, I do get along well with the governor. He came to Litchfield last week to tour the tornado damage and talked to both of them about the need for the special session and the needs that our cities have. And I feel after talking to them that the third week in August is a reasonable possibility.
I won't disagree with them, but I do disagree with them. And I thought when the session ended that you'd you'd never get a special session. I agree, it's 50-50 now, but anyway, next question.
It's better than that.
It's better than that. Okay, we can disagree on that. Yes.
Abraham Algari, Worthington Regional Development. I really do not see too much difference in either of your positions on policy. Both of you, I believe, care about the same issues and want to do the right thing. Where I see a stark difference is between, with all due respect, your understanding of the magnitude of the problem in Greater Minnesota when it comes to economic development and housing, and how you're trying to match that with resources from the state. So when we talk about $4 million for workforce housing as the entire funding for that year, while the problem in Worthington alone, for instance, in Nobles County is close to a $50 million problem today, then we can see the disparity. So what we're saying here, we want you to get your finger on the pulse, on the real pulse, frankly, of the challenging facing us and match those with the resources, investment, long-term investments.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, if we're going to become a world-class economy and have the tools out here in rural Minnesota, workforce housing is a huge portion. And, you know, I mean, I think there's a workforce housing credit that I know the coalition has pushed, which I think would be great. I mean, so many of our kind of centers out here that have a lot of jobs, but there's just nowhere to house them. But it's part of also the internet, transportation, and workforce development and education. I mean, it's not that difficult, it's just making a commitment to it.
Well, I agree, and the $4 million that I mentioned was in the bill a year ago. There, I think, is other monies in the present legislation that's well hung up yet. Now, I will say that what we did, some of us, our rural caucus at the end of session, we met 10:30 one night just before we were going back into session on a Monday, and we developed our list of things that we thought were important to rural Minnesota. And LGA was there, and the commercial industrial property tax, and the education for the farm education credit, and workforce housing, and broadband, and a couple of other items as well. And we brought these to the speaker and explained to him how important these things are to Greater Minnesota and how we were supportive of them. And for the most part, we came out pretty well in the final legislation on those things that we had been asking for. But workforce housing certainly, I think, is something that more needs to be done, more than we were able to get.
Yeah, we can take another question, but just as an aside, we did have $40 million in the Senate tax bill that would have been for a tax credit for workforce housing. That would have been it's the level that you're talking about that we need to talk about more resources in a lot of areas, but good question. Okay, Steve?
Thank you. Steve Nasby, Wyndham. You talked about the importance of local government aid, and you're both supportive of the program, and we certainly thank you for all that support. But we're talking about getting the levels back to 2002, 2003. The state budget's grown many billions of dollars in that period of time. We've also had a lot of inflation in that period of time. How does the legislature think that the cities are going to keep a lid on property tax increases when we've got those kind of pressures and don't have the ability to keep up with LGA?
It certainly is a problem. We had 20 million. I think the coalition was asking for 40 million. Is that right? 45, and I think we're at 20. There are, and you're right. The spending has grown an awful lot since I came to office, and that wasn't my fault. But we're like $42 billion now, and there are all of these demands for money. I mean, maybe not comforting to you, but the answer is that there's a lot of demand for the money that we have. Health and Human Services is growing at a tremendous rate. Spending there, education, still the number one thing that we spend money on in the state of Minnesota. And I'd like to get back up to those numbers that we had before 2002 as well. But we felt, shall we say, fortunate we were able to get to 20 million with what we were doing.
You know, the fact is, and you hit it right on the head, that it was $587 million certified for 2003. We're at 519. We've gone down in those 11 to 12 years. And another point to be made is there was an inflation in at the time. But what you pass off the House floor or the Senate floor has consequences in the final negotiation. So the Senate had 45.5, the Senate minus 84, you wind up at 20. Broadband, Senate 85, House 15, you wind up at 35. If both the House and Senate had gone 45.5, both of them, we'd have 45.5 in the tax bill. And you cities, despite not even keeping up with inflation, but actually going behind on local government aid, and I mentioned just how big of the budget that is, the fact of the matter, in the last 5 years, your average increase on cities, on property tax levies, is about 2.2%. And inflation and growth is over that. You know what we did as a legislature, as far as increasing our budget? About a 2.8% increase each year. So if any of us state officials come to you and say, boy, you wide-eyed liberal mayors out there, you're spending too much, tell them to look at ourselves. I mean, we're talking supposed to be so frugal. We increased our budget at a higher rate than you increased your levies in the last 5 years.
Okay, Dave Sturrock from Marshall. So.
Thank you. Members, thank you very much for coming and making your arguments today. With the recent passing of Governor Anderson, a lot of nostalgia about the good old days and how we got things done. And there's a discount for the rose-colored glass part of it. There's still some pretty clear evidence you guys don't get along these days, your parties, in part because you don't know each other as well, you don't trust each other as well. Would it make a difference in any tangible way if the members of Greater Minnesota from both parties spent more time in the off hours, just socializing, getting to know each other? It used to happen that way in Washington when they were stuck, for weeks at a time. If that happened, it would give you more leverage to deal with your leaders and maybe get some more progress on the things we're talking about today.
Well, I think it would, but I wasn't there in the good old days before 2002 when they were able to do that. But I have heard that because of the Marty provision, there's less mingling of caucus members. Now, we do get out. Well, rural members, after we're done, at least the rural House members, and I assume a lot of the Democrats as well, we go out to eat. I chair the Nutrition Commission. I line up for my little group where we're going to go eat each night. And sometimes a Democrat will come with us. And we welcome, we're bipartisan. But to your point more directly, yeah, I think spending time together is helpful. I stay at the Kelly Inn. And so does Paul. But Paul doesn't hang around the bar at night so much. Now I do, but I am a soda pop drinker. Clark, you maybe can tell. So, but it's mostly Democrats there. Clark is there, and we just sit around and talk. And Representative Anzels and Representative Johnson, we're good friends because we're able to do that. And I think more of it would be good.
We have our partisanship right now, this is a great question, is getting really close to what we have in Congress. And that is really sad. And I think getting together would help more. You actually need more legislators like Representative Plowski and Representative Urdahl and Representative Johnson and Representative Poppy who are willing to work both sides of the aisle. But I think there's something else even more important we could do that would somehow take some of this partisanship out, and Representative Plowski has been a champion on that, and that is government reform. I mean, just little things like being able to see a bill 24 hours in advance would stop some of this partisanship and this blaming back and forth. At the end, people would have time to look at things and so forth, and a number of other reforms that Representative Plowski has looked at. I think that would go a long ways in kind of bringing us back to kind of this kind of gotcha, catching, I mean, fighting and that type of thing. But it has, I mean, I think you said it too. I mean, I noticed it in my 16 years. It is more partisan and just people hunkering down more than ever before.
I don't think we can have time for any more.
One more. You know, it was
One.
basically the same question that this gentleman had. You talked about the wall that you see being constructed between the two parties, and my question was just, what are you both going to do to stop that wall from continuing to grow? And you've sort of addressed it.
Well, I wish there was, you know, you go back and look at that article I mentioned that the Pioneer Press put out, and you can Google that and then put Minnesota House is starkly partisan, and they got that graph, and there's 3 people in the middle: Gene Plowski, Gene Poppy, and myself. There needs to be, instead of 3 out of 134, there should be 100 out of 134 that are willing to work both sides. And that's not happening nearly enough. And it is a culture, and we tend right now, and the DFL is guilty of this too, like a Republican, we tend to, our extremes tend to pull us a little bit too much. But in both political parties, the real balance of power as far as what's going to get done really lies in rural Minnesota. Even though we're outnumbered like 60-40, the fact of the matter is, and this is why you're having this discussion today on what party would the battleground is out in rural Minnesota. The metro areas decided one way, the exurban suburbs decided another way. The battleground is in rural Minnesota. That's why you as a coalition have tremendous influence on who is in majority. And so if rural legislators can get together more and hold more this way, because neither party can do anything without rural members, we could be really quite powerful and have a lot more input than we do by not necessarily working together. So that's a great point. We need to work together more, just even rural legislators.
And too often we lose sight of why we're there. And we are there to represent the people who sent us to St. Paul. And the party structure becomes, you know, so rigid that it makes it sometimes difficult to do that. I remember once, somewhere in the Palenti years, where we had some serious budget concerns, and we did have a rural caucus, Republicans and Democrats who got together to try to come up with a common solution to the problems we were facing. And what happened is, well, first there was a rumor that there was a spy in there going back to leadership, which is probably true. And then we had our ideas, but in the end, when the leadership said it's going to be this way, then everybody followed in line. And I don't know how. We need to, you know, stand up and end that. I'll just on this in our caucus when we were talking about transportation, and we were so into the local roads and bridges, which are important. Obviously, our position overall was better for Greater Minnesota because we wanted to put the money into local roads and bridges, but then you had the light rail, not in my caucus, but we knew that was there. 3 times in caucus, I said to our members, do you really think that we're going to be able to get all of what we want without finding a way that we can get the DFL senators what they want? Do you really think that we can do that? And I said, if you think that way, you're going to suffer some repercussions later on. I said that 3 times. I was going to say it a 4th time, then I thought, they didn't listen to me the other 3 times. But in the end, that is what happened. You know, we can't assume, either side can't assume that they can get everything that they want without dealing with the other. And that's why I think the minority needs to be included more in some of these decisions if we do want a smoother role in government.
Okay, we're going to have to call this to an end. I want you to give a round of applause for our 2 guests.